Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Astera's Centerprise Best Practices webinar series. Today's webinar explores the best ways to use Centerprise to easily and affordably integrate, migrate, and synchronize business partner data with your internal and external applications and databases. Specifically, we'll be covering data source variety, data validation, data conversion, data transmission, deployment, and development. Please be sure to type in your questions, and at the end of the webinar, we'll answer as many as time allows for. We'll capture all questions and answer them in a written Q&A document that we'll post on our blog and our support site. First, I'll do a quick overview of Centerprise. Centerprise is known for its usability. It empowers business users to manage information assets with an intuitive drag-and-drop interface, code-free development, and a single-click data preview feature. Centerprise is highly scalable. It has a high-performance parallel processing engine, 100% .NET code that provides a reliable, scalable, and secure platform and can operate in batch, change, or real-time mode. Finally, Centerprise offers full connectivity for all your data integration needs, including support for all major relational databases, including OLTP and warehousing, support for flat files in common formats such as fixed length, delimited, and Excel, support for hierarchical files such as XML, EDI, JSON, and custom services such as SOAP and REST, and cloud applications such as Salesforce, Microsoft Dynamics, CRM, QuickBooks, and social media. Today's key business partner integration issues revolve around data quality and availability, as well as dealing with a multitude of disparate sources. Dedicating large teams of IT resources is a prohibitive cost to many enterprises. Centerprise offers many benefits to overcome these issues, many of which we'll be talking about today. Centerprise features deliver operation cost savings, increased processing speed, reduced errors, and improved relationships with business partners. It enables data conversions specialists to quickly bring in new data formats, deal with inconsistencies like data format differences and data quality errors, and highlight and resolve data quality issues. And now I'll turn you over to our technical specialist, Mike Oquin, who will be conducting today's webinar. Mike?
This is Michael Quinn. I am giving today's demonstration. I am also the support manager, so if you've had any sort of questions about Centerprise, you probably have gone through me at one point, dealt with me at one point. I also do a lot of the demonstrations and training for Astera software regarding Centerprise as well. So now let's take a look at the product itself. This is what you're looking at. This is Centerprise Data Integrator. This is actually the client portion of the application. It's actually broken up into two portions. There's the client, which you use to develop and design what we call data flows, which is to basically describe the movement of data from point A to point B. And then you have the server component, which resides on either this computer or another computer, in which case this is the engine which transforms the description of the data movement that you defined in basically this data flow document. So just kind of a brief overview of the product that you're looking at here. You see that if you looked at any sort of IDE development tool in the past 10 years or so, this should look very familiar. It's comprised of dockable windows. It's including the Project Explorer. You can put it to the left, you can put it to the right. I like it on the right side. Then you have some dockable windows here at the bottom, and these show you, depending on what the function you're working on, will show you some useful information. But the main window is this document, what we call a document window here in the middle, and this is basically a diagram, and it shows what we call the data flow. Now there's two parts of it. There's the workflow and the data flow, but the main part being the data flow. and in the data flow, you'll see boxes here with the schema or the layout inside the box on both the source and the target, and then you'll see these little mappable triangles here on the right side and on the left side, and these are how you do your actual mapping from source to target. Now you can also click undo to give yourself, you have limited undos to do that. And this, on the right side here we have the project, and on the left side we have the toolbox for this particular example. So you're going to use this toolbox in conjunction with the diagram, and then basically the idea being is when you're done creating this data flow, you stick it in your project. Here I have my project designed by the different vendors. So I have vendor ABC, EFG, HIJ, so on and so forth. And let's take a look at some of them. Vendor ABC has given me their data in a delimited file. So you can see if I hover my mouse over it, it says delimited file source. EFG is giving me the data in a fixed length source, or like a mainframe output. And XYZ is giving me their data in a, I believe, an Excel workbook. So we can take a look and see what that looks like. And that looks like that. And then the other guys looks like this. There's an XML source. And ABC was, again, the delimited source. And EFG with the fixed length type source data, which might look like that. So to handle all of these disparate formats, we're going to make a single data flow per vendor. Now it doesn't have to actually be per vendor because you may have hundreds of vendors, but most likely you might have a finite number of types. So the several vendors might share the same format, and you might receive the data in maybe 10, 12 different formats. So you're actually going to want a data flow per type of vendor rather than per vendor. So let's take a look at what this looks like from this guy here. So here's the limited source here. And the way you get to this point is you look in the toolbox and you'll see the sources section here, and then we'll have a section for destination, and pretty much everything else is a data transformation. But for this section, since we're just concentrating on the disparate formats, let's take a look at some of the sources, meaning start with the delimited source. So the delimited file source, just drag and drop from the toolbox onto the diagram, and you'll get this box, and you'll get a box with a chevron that you can expand and collapse. And you'll also get this tree here, which shows the layout. Now, because it's not configured, we have an empty tree. So let's go ahead and right-click, select Properties, and this will bring open the Properties dialog box, in which case the properties will change depending on which type or which type of file or database that you're pointing to. In this case, the first thing you do is point to the file, click OK, and then you have all the options for dealing with the file delimiters. In this case, my file does contain a header, and I'm going to leave everything else as default. But you can see you have a lot of options for dealing with different types of files. So if I click Next, you'll notice that we got that little delay status progress bar telling us that the Centerprise was doing something. And what it was doing was building the layout automatically. So there's two ways that you can do the layout. You can either type it in this grid yourself, or you can have Centerprise kind of guess what it is. So Centerprise here has guessed that it has 10 columns, and it's even guessed the different data types for those columns. Now the data types are not really necessary. You could just treat everything as a string and copy it to every single value, or you can let Centerprise guess the data types, which is useful when you're doing conversions or calculations based on numbers. For example, you wouldn't want to have to convert the text values to integers. Doing this method will convert them right away. So this is the automatic layout building. This applies to both delimited and fixed and Excel and database schemas as well. There's also another method you can build a layout, and this is particularly useful for the example of a fixed length file. So let's go to the next one, which I believe is this one. There we go. So here, just to remind you, the data looks like this, and we want to be able to parse it to mark where the fields are in this data, because this is not just one field, it's actually several fields stuck together. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and select the properties here and click Next. And you can see here where I have all the fields already defined here. I can create new fields by just clicking inside the fixed length editor here. Or what I can do is select Build from Layout Spec, in which case if I have the layout specifications in some Excel file, I can point to that file and automatically use that file to automatically build the next screen here, which is the layout. So now that I have the layout, I can just map to my target and be done with it. Okay, so that is the case of the delimited, the disparate file formats and the automatic layout building. So oftentimes, though, that you have data not just in one file, but but you have it in multiple files. So for example, let's take a look at vendor HIJ. HIJ has sent us their data in an access table, an access database, which is comprised of multiple tables. So for this example, I need to get it into my staging table. I need to get data from two different data sources. In this case, we have the members and we have the payments. And I need to combine them in order to get into my member payment table, which is my target for this example. So to do so, we're going to make use of the join transformation. You'll find the join transformation under the transformation section. And this component does exactly that. It does a join. So it's very similar to a database join. So if I preview here at this section, you can see that this is the data that I'm getting from members, including the member number. And then these are what the payments look like per member. And you can see that I have this member number again. So I need to join on this column. To do so, I just open the properties for this. Here's the layout again. And I'm just going to say, okay, wherever the left field member number is equal to the right field member number, and you can see that these are, I'm going to do an inner join. And you can see that this is mapped to member number one and member number. When these two fields match, I'm going to consider it a single record. And now I have a single data set for me to transfer into my target database table. So this is a very common scenario where your vendor data might come in multiple database tables. It might come in multiple files. For example, you might have a workbook where the information is stored on multiple worksheets. You would have to do this type of joining in that scenario as well. You also might have a scenario where you have the client data, which is from your vendor, but you also need to transform it with data that you already have as part of your internal systems. So for example, let's say that I have the organization code has to be translated to some other type of code. I can use a join to join those values together. So for example, let's say I have this member corporate codes Excel sheet at my disposal, and it has two fields, the member number and the corporate code. I can then take the information from my Excel sheet and join it with this other Excel sheet to give me the appropriate corporate code. So to do that, let's just let's run through that again. So I'm going to drag and drop the join, and here you can see that there's a little shortcut here that if you drag and drop from the toolbox onto the to the node and it lights up with red, it'll insert it into the flow. So let's undo that transformation. And as we scroll down here, we'll see the new member object element, I should say, and map to them. So here we go, member number and corporate code. Let's do the join, sort, and at any time we have the member number and member number. I think, did I do that right? This is the, I'm sorry, this is the ID is what it should be joining on. So ID and member number. Okay, so anytime these two match, I'll now have the corporate code which I can map to my target. There we go. So in this case, I've used two separate data sources in order to get a single data source in order for me to map into my table. Now the join will work just on two data sources, but you can join a join with another join, with another join, with another join to get as complicated as you need to for the database. And further in this demonstration, I'll show you how you can do this one time and set up basically a data model by use of a subflow. So you can just define these joins all in one place and then use it over and over again in subsequent data flows. So for now, that is the case where we're mixing and matching data from disparate data sources. Okay, so now going back to the PowerPoint. The next section is data quality and structural variations. So for example, you might have to validate data on a consistency basis to make sure that the data that's coming into your systems adheres to a certain data quality, level of quality. You might have several business rules that the data has to conform to. If not, you might have to route it for further data massaging, or maybe even outright rejecting the records and sending them back to your partner. So for that, let's go back to Centerprise, and let's take a look at what that might look like. So in this case, let's preview the data. And here you can see that we have a couple of things. We have we have a date here which is from the future, so we can obviously see that this is incorrect. And we also have I believe we have some data that's missing here. If we scroll down far enough. I'm not sure what it was. Oh, the payment type. I believe this is the one that's missing some data. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this one. We don't really need it. And let's go to our toolbox here, and let's look at the data profiling section. So in the data profiling section, I'll see data quality rules and several other utilities to help me in this regard. So, but for now, the focus is on data quality rules. So let's go ahead and attach this to payment type, which will insert it in between. And let's also hook up the payment date. So if you remember looking at the data preview, we had two things wrong with this data. One, we had some dates coming in the future, and the other thing was that we had some missing payment types. So in order for us to do that, we're going to have to create some business rules for that. So let's go ahead and delete this one and hook it up to here, payment date and payment type. All right, now opening the properties for this data quality rule, we're going to define two rules. Payment date is okay, or let's just call it check instead. That's a better name for it. And I'm going to attach it to the payment date. And I'm going to say payment date cannot be in the future. So I'm going to say payment date is less than now. Okay, so this is my simple rule, and by the way, this is the Astera rules language. And you'll find this throughout the application if you're setting up rules or transformations and filters, and we'll be covering this in a few minutes when we're talking about data conversions. So the second one is the payment type rule. Payment type check, and I'm just going to attach it to the payment type. Payment type must be present. And I'm just going to say is not null, payment type. Now I have my two rules defined here. If I preview the data, you can see that once I've attached this rule, now if I scroll down, you'll see that I have several places where I have this little red exclamation point. So this red exclamation point is just telling me that there is something wrong with this data at that particular field. And if I hover my mouse over it, you see payment type must be present, and payment date cannot be in the future. So now this error message is stamped to the actual record, and as long as the record as long as this field is kept throughout the data flow, this error will also be attached to it. And you can do several interesting things with this error stamp on the record. So at this point, though, we can just join must be linked to two transformations. It's linked to one transformation. Oh, okay, so I don't really need the join here. Let's get rid of it. Delete action and reroute maps. And let's preview at this point, actually. Okay, so now I have the error message here, and I can actually do a quick profile as well. By doing a quick profile, you can see that I have showing me that for 1,000 records, what my error percentage is. And here you can see that I have 3 out of 1,000 records and 4.30% errors. And for payment type, payment amount, payment date, and payment code, I have 100% nulls, probably because it's not mapped. That's my guess here, and that is correct. So let's map that. And now let's do the quick profile, and I should get a different number under the payment code. There we go. So now I have 15 records in error and then 3 records for the payment date. So now what can I do with this information? Well, we can make use of this information by turning on the data quality mode. So if I push this button here, you'll see that I instantly get a new node in the tree, and this is the messages node. The messages node contains a lot of useful information, such as how many errors we encountered and what particular error message we got. So for example, what we can do here is we can route records depending on their quality. So now that we could pass, and we can pass through the entire schema through data quality checks and create a check for every single field. In this case, we're just doing it for 2. So what I'm going to do is route the record based on the fact of whether or not it contains an error or not. So I'm going to go to my toolbox, look in the transformation section, and drag and drop the route onto the target here. And I've instantly inserted a route transformation in my data flow. And you can see that I have an input, which is coming from these 2 boxes, and I have a default output, which is going straight away to my target credit staging table here. So what I'd like to do now is create a rule based on the error count. So I'm going to go to my input, drag and drop onto new member, and drag the messages text as well. Open this up, and again you'll see the same screen that you see everywhere. And I'm going to create a rule which is going to be just bad records. Okay, and my rule is going to be as simple as error count is greater than 0. Now that I have this rule, now I'm routing records based on if it contains an error or not. So all these now contain 0 errors. And if I do a preview or a quick profile again, you can see that the payment code has 0% errors, and the payment date, which is here somewhere, payment date also has 0% errors. All the bad records have now been outputted through this node in the route transformation. So what we can do is, let's say for example, we just want to log this information. So I want to go to a file and say, okay, these are my error records. Okay, point to where I want these to go. Bad records. Click OK. And now define my layout. I'm just going to do a quick shortcut here by dragging and dropping the bolded node onto the bolded node. And this will automatically create my layout for me. And here you can see that I have also not only the error count but the message text. I can preview at this point, and you can see that every single one of these records has something wrong with it. Most of them are missing the payment code. So, and not only that, but I also have the message text way over here at the end here, so you can see that I get not only the error, the fact that it contains an error, how many errors, and a concatenated list of error messages. So this is great if I just want to know what the error records are, but let's say that I wanted to further do something with them and correct the errors as well. So basically, not only error routing, but also doing data corrections. So for that, let's take a look at something else we have in our project here. And in this case, I have a corrections folder. And for this type of data, for this layout, I've created what we call a subflow. And I'm just going to drag and drop here. And in between, and the subflow is my correct data correction subflow. So you can see my input looks like this. Very similar to the existing format. And my output also looks like this. So this is my canonical input that I'm going to use anytime I need to do data correction. So best practices is that you create a standard input interface, and this will be the interface for all of your vendor data, no matter what it looks like. And all you have to do is map that particular vendor's data format into your interface that you've provided through this subflow. So in this case, I'm just going to remove all inbound maps, and I'm going to send the band records to be corrected. So here's my input, and the output is going to go straight away to the table. Now you cannot map 2 different data sets, this being one data set and this being the second data set, into the table. So what we're going to have to do is make use of a union transformation. So let's take a look. Let's do that. Let's go union. First input will be the default good records, and the second input will be the output of the subflow. So this will be the corrected output, And now I have my union, and I can take the output and take that into the desired table. So now, without knowing anything about anything what this subflow is doing, I can use this component, and I know that this component corrects data because someone else wrote it for me. And all I got to worry about is a black box, as I know that the data going in, as soon as it goes in, it'll be fixed and normalized in order for me to use it and onboard it, just like the good records. So this brings up the point of abstracting different separations of concerns. So you might have one person that's all they're doing is mapping the difference between the vendor data and your canonical interface. And then you have the actual person who's developing the innards of the data flow by means of a subflow. So if you actually take a look at the subflow, you can see it's very simple. We just have an input and an output. And it's just a very simple function, which if we take a look at inside, it's just basically doing some very simple processing. If it's empty, write standard, and then if the date is in the future, subtract a year from it, because we're just going to assume that it was from last year. So that's the basics of this particular data flow correction or subflow correction, but you can imagine where you can get quite complicated involving multiple subflows, and you can have multiple nestings of subflows as well. So this is a very common scenario when you're doing this type of data, where you not only want to route records, but you also want to route records and then do some further processing based on what particular error they have. So this is something we highly recommend doing if you have this type of scenario. Okay, so with that being said, let's take a look at, so the next section is the kind of the meat of the product, and that is the data conversion piece. So a lot of times it's not just mapping, this field goes here and this field goes there. A lot of times it's a lot more complicated than that. You might have fields intermingled with other fields. You might have to perform logic in order to extract data from it. You might have to use a regular expression in order to identify and parse the particular field to get other fields and manipulate, trim leading strings, make everything uppercase or lowercase. There's a whole host of things, and pretty much anything you can imagine with your data you can do with Centerprise, including text normalization, such as name and address parsing. A very common thing is to manipulate text data or string manipulation. You might need to apply single changes to the entire file. Centerprise is very good at that. A very common task is to perform a lookup. So you need a translation of data from one type to another. So let's say your partner has a payment code, which is in one code format, you have it in another. You need to map those together and create a translation table. Centerprise can help you do that. It's also very good at creating interfaces, and this is a kind of a best practice, is that anytime you're dealing with this type of scenario, you set up an interface and use that interface everywhere. And you would typically do so using subflows. And finally, you're going to want to use a divide and conquer approach, and this is where the route transformation comes into play. So let's take a look at what I mean by these things in the product. So let's go back here. And first of all, let's take an example of, so we're looking at data conversion. So in customer ABC's data flow, for example, I believe it's this one, we have last name and first name here, and we have the format in a single last name, comma, first name, space, middle initial. So this is not going to map directly into our interface here. So what we need to do is make use of the transformations. And the most common transformations for these types of scenarios are going to be the function transformation, the expression transformation, and one of the lookup transformations. So let's go ahead and take a look at the function transformations. And specifically, you can see here we have a whole host of function transformations, including files, mathematicals, being able to use regular expressions, GUID file function, date time functions, conversion functions, but the most popular probably one is the string function. Here you can see we have a whole host of string functions here. For this example though, I'm going to use the name and address parsing functions. So right now I only have parse name. We do sell another component that enables you to take a single address field and parse it out in different tokens. It's not not in the scope of this demonstration, but just know that it's there built in. So you don't have to build it yourself using Centerprise. It is available at a nominal fee in addition to the standard Centerprise package that you might purchase. So in this case, though, I'm just going to use a simple parse name function and drag it onto name. And here you'll see that I have the name as input, and the output I have my first name being mapped to first name and last name being mapped to last name. So, and middle initial being mapped to middle name here. There it is. Okay, so now if I preview my data, you can see that I have my last name and first name going into the correct columns. So this is an example of just using a function directly. Many times, though, you might need to do something a bit more complicated than using the expression directly. For example, let's take a look at what is it? It might still be this one. Yes. Okay. So this one I need to take the corporation code, and you can see that this customer ABC has an ingenious way to save space or something, but they've combined the different codes with the first three letters of the organization name. So they kind of created their own identifier, or unique key, by combining the first three letters of the organization's name followed by the organization's code. That's well and great, but now I need to be able to extract that information. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my transformation section, drag and drop an expression transformation, and now I have the organization I'm going to feed into it, and the expression I'm going to name breakdown org data. Okay, and you can see that I have a single input here, and the magic is going to happen when I click on the properties here, and you'll see this screen. So this screen is where I'm going to have basically the layout, and I'm going to have these columns here, followed by a last column, which is the expression. So I have the organization, which is input and output. I can use it as both, but I'm going to create, let's say I'm going to separate them into prefix. So let's say corp prefix and corp code. And I'm going to create them as strings. And for these guys, I'm just going to assign them as variables. And I could just make them outputs, but just to kind of show you how this works, I'm going to create a variable here. So now I have corp prefix, corp code, and I have corp code out and corp name out. And again, these are string values, but this time these ones are strictly outputs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to involve expressions in several of these, and for the prefix I'm going to click here. This little button here will bring up the expression builder, and all I'm going to do is use some of the string manipulation functions. So I'm going to say corp prefix is the left, so I'm going to say left number of characters is this one, corp organization, and take the first three characters. And for corp code, I'm going to take the right 5 characters, because I think that is a variable number of letters here. So where is right, and organization, and take 5 characters. Okay, so now I have that information, and for these ones, all I'm going to do is take the values of corp prefix. Oops, not that one. I want corp name, corp code. Which one is that one? Corp prefix, corp code, corp code. Okay, and for the next one, I have corp prefix. So the reason why I did this is to kind of illustrate the input, output, and variable nature of this. So the way that these are, there's a certain order of operations. It first goes input, then variable, then output. So I can take advantage of this to store variables for the next record. And this becomes very valuable in the case which comes up a lot in these scenarios where you're dealing with vendor data, in that you have duplicate data within the data set. So what you can actually do is use the expression to create your own deduping mechanism. So, but I won't go into that in this webinar. That's a webinar for another topic. So in this case, though, you can see that I have now my expression set up with my outputs set up. So I now have my corp code out and the corp name out. So it's not the full name, but it'll do for our demonstration purposes. So at this point here, you can see that I've extracted the corp code using an expression transformation. Okay, so this is one case where you need to transform and manipulate fields as it's going through your data here. So let's say that I need to do beyond that. I need my first name and last name all uppercase. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and go back to my function transformations and use the string one section here to make everything uppercase. So just a couple of clicks, I can find my, where is it at? To upper, there we go. So I'm going to hook that up to name, and now if I preview, you'll see that I have first name and last name to uppercase. That's great. What if I want all of my data in uppercase? Well, I can just keep doing the to upper, to this guy, right? And just keep going on and on and on. But what would be better, though, is rather than having all of these little functions littering my diagram, I can make use of the apply to all transformation. So this is kind of a little known transformation, but for these types of scenarios, it's very powerful because it allows me to do file-wide or data set-wide transformations within a single box, and very easy to use. So let's go ahead and apply this here. So for every single field that is of a certain data type, I'm going to, let's say, map street, city, name, so on and so forth. And every field that I map into it, I'm going to apply that expression. So I'm just going to say to upper, apply to, and you see that you only have the one field here, which is field value, and you click OK, and now I can preview my data here. I'm just not going to hook it up for the rest of the way, and you can see that it applied that expression to everything. So whether you need to trim strings, you need to do some sort of special logic check, you don't have to map to every single field. You can use the apply to all transformation. Okay, another common feature that you're going to use when doing this type of data conversion is you're going to need the case use the case of lookups here. So in this case where I have data which looks like this, so I have my payment type, which is coming from customer XYZ, to pay, delinquent, to pay extra. The actual data in my database does not look like that. If I actually view the table data, you can see that my payment codes look like this. So I have a different language in describing what a payment type looks like. So for that, I need to use a lookup. So a very simple one is to use a list lookup, and in which case I'm going to map payment type and right-click and say fill lookup list with all unique input values. This will give me a nice starting place where I can start, mapping these to P98, CU, whatever my typical lookup code is. So I may not have I may have these embedded in the flow because this is pertaining to this particular custom lookup here, or I may need to use this with other customers of the same type. So here's a trick here. So anytime you have a list lookup and you have a feeling that you're going to reuse it, what you can do is drag and drop it onto the project, and what will happen is that it will make this grayed out, and now I have my my lookup as a shared action available to be able to use for future purposes. So this is a case where I have a list lookup where it's embedded. You can imagine where I might have a information in a file, such as this one here. You can see if If I preview here, I already have my lookup codes defined somewhere else outside of this flow. For that, I can use a file lookup, which behaves the exact same way. We also have database table lookups, web service lookups, SQL statement lookups, and SOAP and RESTful web services lookups. So you can actually use just about any source that you can connect to as a lookup to do that code translation. So another part, very important part of data conversion is creating interfaces. So for example, we have this situation where I have a very simple mapping here, right? You can see where I'm doing this, routing error records, unioning, and I'm mapping it to a single spot. But let's say that I'm not, that most likely you don't have it just a very simple, easy to map table like this. Possibly you might have to map it into more than one table. So the actual load XYZ payments might look more like this, where you have reading from data file, you're performing lookups to see if the other dependent records exist, and you're loading into 3 different entities or more. So doing this per vendor can be quite cumbersome and also quite redundant. So what you're going to want to do is create what we call a subflow, and you already saw the subflow, which was responsible for correcting that information. What we want to do, though, is create an interface where we can then map into it without having to worry about all of the details of that mapping. What goes on, such as all the lookups, all the data corrections, all the functions, all the complicated stuff. We can actually abstract and just represent that as a black box with a certain interface. So we can do that by just copying everything, creating new subflow, pasting it onto that, and and for subflow, I'm going to need the input. So for the input, I'm going to want to actually not use this one here. I can do a shortcut here and say set as input, which will allow me to preview, but I don't want this interface, right? Because this is customer XYZ's interface. What I want is my original interface, and that's going to come from this guy. Ooh, not this one. This one. Right? So this is my custom interface, which I want to use standard no matter which mapping I'm using. So for that, I'm going to replace and save it. And when I save it, now going back to my multi-table example here, what I can do is remove everything, and now I'm back to a single mapping where I have my payment interface. And here you can see I have payment interface, and now I can just map directly into that interface. And all of the handling of multiple tables, all the data quality checks, all that stuff is handled in a black box fashion, and allows me to quickly map into this common interface. So now I have my client XYZ being mapped into this. I can go into my other mappings here. So change customer ABC. So rather than it doing all of this jazz, I can do all of this in my subflow and just replace that with my common payment interface. So it maps nicely, and so this means that as I get new files, I can very quickly map into this common interface without having to worry about making a mistake, something changing from, I don't have to change it per vendor. So it allows me to quickly add new maps and make changes to my entire system all at once. Okay, so so that is the case of the creating an interface. So now let's take a look at some of the other sections here, and we're kind of running out of time, but I'll try and get through this as quickly as possible. So I'm going to skip the divide and route conquer approach, but basically this means that kind of like we were talking about with our error routing, the idea is that you're going to want to route records depending on the data that there is. So if you have processing a data type processing records depending on the type, you're going to want to divide them into different bins and do that processing with those different subflows. So much like we had our create, our correct data subflow, you're going to have subflows for process this type of record, that type of record, rather than trying to do it in the same flow here. So moving on. Data transmission. So the important part is not only do you have to interact with the data once you get it, but you might have to pull the data from your vendor's, let's say, FTP site, or you might have to email them a response for once you've received your file, and also you might have to connect to your various vendors' web services. So let's take a look at that in the product as well. So in this case, let's say that we have, for processing file XYZ, we need to first get the data, or I'm sorry, download files for customer ABC. So that might look like this, where you have a FTP action, and this is a workflow. So basically what we're going to do is, in addition to loading the ABC data, we're going to download the files, and then we're going to remove the file once we're done with it. So here you can see that we have a couple of different tasks, including FTP task. We have the remove file task. We're getting close to the end. I hear someone breathing on the microphone, so I think that might be my cue there. So we have the download FTP task, so we can take a look at what that task looks like. So we're going to connect to the port. We're going to find the remote file path. And one thing, kind of a note, which you might not know when you're dealing with the FTP task, is that we support wildcards. So your data might look like this, where it has a file name and then followed by a date, and you're going to need to process it, multiple files, and you don't want to grab just one, you want to grab them all and then be able to process each one of those in your subsequent data flow. Likewise, you might have a process where you need to send a file back. So for example, loading our XYZ customer information, we've defined a variable called error count in there. So we're going to use that variable if it has an error, if the error count is greater than 0. We're going to go ahead and notify the vendor that there was error information in that data file, and we're going to go ahead and attach that file and send it back to them. Likewise, we have tools for dealing with web service data. So here you'll find in the RESTful web service, we have kind of different flavors of being able to communicate via web service. We have the RESTful web service, will allow you to make RESTful web service calls. You basically just provide your URL, base resource, what kind of authentication you're using, and it basically behaves just like any of the other data sources. Same thing with Slope, slightly different. You just need the WSDL, provide the WSDL, and you're able to contact your business processes, either your internal services or external services, and read data from them. Okay, so when we're talking about development in Centerprise and how that helps in this scenario, we're talking about two different things. We're talking about being able to develop at a high level. So that means our drag and drop interface that you've been seeing. So I didn't write any code. If I were to write, program my own code for that, the development, testing, even an existing program, and I needed to add to it. Let's say I needed to add a new vendor. That would have to go through its own stage of Q&A, its own development lifecycle. Centerprise shortens that lifecycle dramatically, and it also opens up development to maybe someone who's not necessarily a programmer but understands their data very well. It enables me to very quickly preview the data and profile what the data is supposed to look like and make sure that I'm conforming to that data without having to go through an external process. I can do it very quickly in the product. And then finally, it gives me a separation of concerns. As you can see, that the one part of the mapping was much easier to do than the other part of the mapping. So if I'm mapping to the interface is just a black box for me, possibly done by someone else who understands data normalization, denormalization, maybe some of those more complex expressions. but I know how, I have a definition of how this customer's data relates to that interface. So I can actually have work in a collaborative effort, have different people doing different jobs. Talking about efficient development is where we talk about projects and reusability. This is entirely on you as a user, as a developer of Centerprise. As if you follow best practices, make use of projects, think ahead of time of how your data is going to be, how you're going to acquire new vendor data, and how that's going to, basically what the process is for acquiring new vendor data, and how easy it is to do it, and how reusable it is to do it. So for example, if I have a brand new customer, let's say, let's call him customer new guy. So I'm going to create my folder. So this is my process, new guy. I'm going to create a new flow for him. So I just add new data flow, load new guy flow, or payments.df. And go to my data sources, say this is my delimited file source, go to my data sources, say new partner data 2, click next, OK, and now go back to my common payment interface, map it, and now I have it ready to go. And then continue the mapping, so on and so forth. So here I've demonstrated that with a little foresight, I was able to quickly accommodate new vendor data and make use of the reusable items in Centerprise. So which brings me to the last section of our demonstration, which is deployment, which involves automation, running things ad hoc, processing large volumes, and file processing. So in this case, so basically what I'm going to concentrate on is automation and how to make use of that, how to basically deploy this project that I've created. So to do that, what some of our customers do, and this is nothing wrong with it, is that they will create the project and they have my data flow per vendor, and they'll save it and then shut down Centerprise. When they get a file which is not on a scheduled basis, they will open Centerprise, say I'm going to run customer XYZ's payments, go back to here, and then just click the Run button. So clicking the Run button will run this ad hoc. It'll submit it to the server, run it, and you'll get your results in your job progress view. You can click on any source files to see what those source or target files look like, and then you just shut Centerprise once you're done with it. More commonly, though, is that you have a scheduled process for communicating with your partner, and you're going to need to automate that. So for that, you're going to go to the Server Explorer, and you're going to see here in your server, you're going to want to click on Job Schedules. And here you can see that I have a list of job schedules, and at this point you have you have a kind of a choice to make at this point. You can either create a schedule per customer, or you can create one schedule and then process the results of let's say that you have all customers writing into the same FTP location. I'm going to download all of those files, and then based on those files, I'm going to run one or more of the data flows. So let's take the example A where I'm running per customer. So I would say run payment info for customer ABC, pick that flow process. In this case, it's a workflow. It could be a data flow, and I'm going to run it once, every day at a certain time. So it's going to download all those files, and then I will process that using the workflow, which might involve moving files from one bin to another, deleting a file, renaming it. All that processing will be handled with my orchestration workflow component. So the second, then I'm going to save it, and then keep adding another schedule per customer. So, but another thing I might do, and this is an option, something you might want to take a look at, is where you might have a workflow which handles everything. So let's say I have so let's take a look at my process workflow data. So in this case, you can see that the first thing I'm doing is I'm going to get the file, and then I'm going to load XYZ's payment information. So what I could do, though, is structure my data flows in such a way that depending on some previous logic coming from reading the file system, I'm going to supply the actual job file path, which means that rather than having a separate schedule and different workflow process, rather than repeating this workflow for every single different type of customer, I can now make use of some logic, supply the job file path, and now have a dynamic data flow here. So depending on the logic, I can either be processing XYZ's data using this flow. I could be processing customer ABC's data using that flow. And it allows me to very quickly add new partner types without having to add to the overhead complexity, without adding new orchestration, because most likely you're going to have the single orchestration going to be repeated over and over again. So if you can make use of the dynamic data flow path, go for it. It'll make your anytime you can make your project smaller and don't repeat yourself, the better. Okay, so that takes care of the demonstration portion as far as using Centerprise. I would like to now go over questions. I'm sorry I'm a little over. If you cannot stay for this Q&A session, you'll find these questions and answers available on our website, and we'll show you those after the demonstration. So let's go ahead and look at the questions here. So can we do data correction as part of a flow if we encounter bad data coming from a partner? So yes, so let's take a look at our, we believe we had one of these flows here, which was it this one? Correct data, here it is. So here we have our flow, which is routing data, and it's sending bad records to our correct data subflow. So if we actually take a look at what that subflow is doing, we can see it's not doing much actually for this demonstration. It's just using a single expression, and it is mapping the fields that need to be corrected, in this case the payment code and the date. If we take a look at inside of what those expressions are, we can see that the first one is taking a look at payment code. If it's null or empty, write standard. For the payment date, if the payment date is greater than the future, so go ahead and subtract a year. We're going to assume that they meant last year. So, not very robust expressions here, but just to give you an example that you can use expressions in order to manipulate your data, not just for extracting data or manipulating data to get it into that canonical interface, but you can also use expressions to fix data depending on some business logic that you have set up whenever you encounter these types of data anomalies. Okay, question number 2. Do you have any raw data filter for files, something similar to where clause for SQL queries? Yes, very good question. So if we take a look at one of these, let's take a look at customer ABC because they had the limited file here. If you take a look at the options here, you can see that at the bottom here we have this raw text filter. So you can see here that we have no filter, process all records, process if begins with, process if matches this regular expression. So there's two ways to filter the data. One is you can use that. You can use the filter transformation, which will allow you to filter the data before it even gets to your interface here. It'll use another Astera rules language expression in order to filter. But this involves first reading the data, so meaning that you might have a data set which has maybe records defined in a certain format, and other records, let's say you might have the header repeating throughout the document. You don't want to process that header as an erroneous record. So if you have data that looks like that, you would not use the filter transformation. You would instead use this raw text filter. So you might say if it begins with customer something, or you might even have a regular expression where you might say, okay, this starts with a character that's 5 characters long, followed by a space, so on and so forth. So you can use the raw text filter to get just what you're looking for. Okay, question number 3. Can a subflow interface represent multi-level data? Yes. Okay, so what you saw here in this subflow interface is that I had just a flat structure here, but it is, in fact, a hierarchical structure. So let's go ahead and take a look at, let's just create a new subflow. So I'm going to create new subflow, and my subflow input is going to look like this. And I'm going to get my actual input from, I believe it's QRS. They had the payment. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just copy the layout here, and I'm going to paste it. And this is kind of a nice little trick that maybe you might not know about if you're familiar with it. So I'm going to paste the structure here. So now I have my interface, which looks like this, and I can map to it just as I could the flat structure. Okay, does Centerprise support secured FTP? Yes, it does. So if we go back to our download files, you can see that the options we have for FTP, connection method FTP, SFTP, and if you're old school, SCP even. So, and FTP you can connect using FTPS settings as well. Okay, how do you recommend to organize mappings to our vendors? Well, that's entirely up to you. I recommend that you design your project in such a way that you're easily able to map into, to create a new to acquire a new vendor and basically create a new node in your project. So I would have as much common information as possible, and the goal being able to be able to make these sets of data files per vendor as small as possible, so that you're reusing a lot of the common structures. So I would do something like this, where I add a folder per vendor, or maybe even some naming conventions for the data flows. And I'd want to make the flows as generic as possible, so that I can use them in a dynamic data flow situation. So that basically to reduce the redundancy as much as possible. Okay, next question is there any object for bookmarking newly added files into an FTP server? So for that, what you're going to want to use is a component here called the file entries source. So what this allows you to do is basically list the files in that FTP folder. So I'm going to go ahead, actually not this one. I dragged and dropped the wrong one. It should be this one, list FTP contents directory, which will give me the contents of the file. So let's take a look at just XYZ here. And this one just has the one file. That's not the one I want. I want folder ABC. Okay, so there we go. So this one has a file in it, and I'm able to see when the file was created, what the size is, who the owner is, and what the file name is. So the idea here is that you get that data set. You can then filter that data set based on the date. Let's say the last time you processed all this information, the next time you're going to filter it, and so you get a different set of data for that FTP list. I can then use this FTP list as a driver, and then in a workflow, which then allow me to, let's say, remove all those files that I've just then processed. Which brings me to the next kind of a point that I skipped over in the main section of the in this webinar, is that for this type of situation, we recommend that you have some sort of file processing kind of system set up for handling these files. So step one might be download the file. Step two might be move that file into, so you might have a file system action, which is move that file into a bin for to be processed. The third step will be process that data. After that step is done, you might have a next step which says, move to completed bin. So if you follow this kind of pattern, it'll save you in the situation with, okay, I had something go wrong with the data. I need to go back and restart from a certain point. which, by the way, Centerprise Server allows for, which I won't get into at this point, but you can restart the two different sections of your workflow. So if you've done this pattern where you start moving files around, it'll allow you to easily get back to a point and not have to kind of wonder and find what happened to your data, what happened to the file. Is part of the file processed? Is this file good? Did it process? If you follow this pattern, you'll be good to go, and it'll be very well organized and be able to recover from flow processing errors. Okay. Any other questions? I think that's it for now. If you have any other questions, the ones I did not answer, you'll find the answers to on the on our website. Okay. And feel free to ask any other questions, and you can submit them to sales@astera.com. You can call us, our sales staff, directly at this number. This number is also on our website. You can email manira.lalani@astera.com, and she'll be happy to answer all your sales questions. If you have any sort of question at all, not related to sales, or maybe just how does the product work, you can visit us at astera.com. Click on our support link, and it'll take you to our form, which you can ask a question, and we'll give you a response in about a day. Okay, that is it for our demonstration. I thank you for participating. You will find this webinar up on our website. In case you missed it or you came in late, you can find the entire thing in video form for download in a couple days. Thank you for attending. My name is Michael Quinn from Astera Software, and I thank you for